What is up, everyone? Welcome to Swan Signal Live. I'm your host, Sam Callahan, Senior Analyst at Swan Bitcoin. Today, we got a great show lined up, but once again, I want to bring to attention Pacific Bitcoin. That is the festival that Swan puts on every year in October in beautiful Santa Monica. We bring in a bunch of speakers, satellite events. There's going to be a ton of celebrities, professional athletes. It's a great time. So go check it out. Talk to some Bitcoiners in real life, not just on Twitter or X, whatever you call it. So check it out. Go to promo code at Signal to get 10% off your tickets today. And you can also use Bitcoin to get an additional 21% off. So 31% off your tickets if you go to pacificbitcoin.com, if that interests you. So today, what we're going to be talking about is a lot of Bitcoin in politics. That is a major difference compared to previous cycles where we actually see presidential candidates having a position on Bitcoin. It's becoming a policy issue because Bitcoin has grown so much, it's become so mainstream that now it's being discussed on the Congress floor and by presidential candidates. And because of that, I think it's so important that we advocate for Bitcoin and educate these policymakers to make sure that they understand the nuances of this technology and what it could bring to the United States of America. And I have the perfect guest that's kind of focused on that, and that's Lee Bratcher, the president of the Texas Blockchain Council. So welcome, Lee. It's a pleasure to have you on Swan Signal Live.
Thanks, Sam. It's an honor to be here.
Yeah, so maybe let's just start off with like a typical podcast, but I think it would be helpful for people to understand like who you are, how you came to Bitcoin, and what is some of the work that you're doing at the Texas Blockchain Council.
Yeah, so the Texas Blockchain Council is obviously advocating for Texas to be the jurisdiction of choice for Bitcoin innovation. We specialize in Bitcoin mining predominantly because around 40% of US hash rate is in Texas. So we've got deep expertise around advocacy, lobbying, policy, grid policy, as well as here in the legislature. And so I founded the TBC in 2019. So we're a relatively young organization, but we've been able to pass several pieces of legislation over the years in partnership with great organizations like Swan and others. And so, we're kind of on this next frontier where we're working on federal policy as well as state and local policy.
Yeah, I feel like Texas has quickly become a leader in Bitcoin in at least the United States. I was actually at the North American Blockchain Summit that you guys put on. It was one of my favorite events that I went to all year. And one of the reasons is why is there was like a presidential candidates there talking about Bitcoin. And it was really exciting to see them to kind of discuss it and share their views. I figure that you are having personal conversations with them as well. And I wanted to get your thoughts about what is the level of understanding for some of these presidential candidates and politicians when it comes to Bitcoin, and how has it evolved maybe since 2019 when you started the organization?
Yeah, well, it's certainly part of the conversation for us to be able to get somebody like RFK or Vivek Ramaswamy to come to the summit. They understand that there is or there are single issue voters out there for them to speak to. And so I'd say for somebody like RFK Jr., his record on privacy and small government is well known. He transcends political parties. Of course, he's running as an independent. He was a Democrat, but he has some views that align with a little bit of libertarianism as well. So he was a unique candidate to have there. Glad that he could come out. He was actually on the cover of Bitcoin magazine. I think the cover came out the day before he came on stage with us. And, I think he's quite familiar with Bitcoin. He's spoken a lot of Bitcoin events, and his interest, I think, comes from the censorship resistant side of
Mhm.
the asset. Whereas Vivek Ramaswamy, I used to call him Vivek, and he corrected me. He said, "Hey, it's Vivek like cake." And I didn't know that. But his interest is more from the finance world. Like he's a finance guy, business guy, perhaps a little bit less, privacy centric or philosophically aligned as RFK, but probably more aligned in sort of the macroeconomic components of Bitcoin. And one of his main points that he's actually already brought to the Trump campaign is that Bitcoin is the antithesis of a CBDC. They're the opposite sides of the coin. So we've already got Trump coming out against CBDCs, and there'll be very few Democrats that are even going to be for CBDCs pretty soon. I think just a certain few that are interested in government censorship at a unhealthy level.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. I know, to me, there's like two paths forward when it comes to like money in the digital age, and it's CBDCs and Bitcoin. And you mentioned some legislation that you guys were able to help get passed in Texas. Maybe you can break down a little bit about what those were and how you guys continue to kind of create this safe haven for Bitcoin innovation within the state of Texas. There's different states have taken different approaches. What comes to mind is New York putting a temporary ban on getting permits. They've taken a different approach. Texas obviously is embracing Bitcoin more. So explain some of your strategy and some of the legislation that's passed.
Yeah, it's been interesting to get to know elected officials in Texas, and I think people think that everybody's just pro Bitcoin here, and unfortunately, it's not the case. We try to project that image, but there are a lot of elected officials, especially older elected officials, that really have no idea what it is, and that's both on the Democratic and Republican side of the aisle. But when we passed our first legislation, that was back in 2021, and we passed two bills. One of them was House Bill 4474, which essentially codified in the Uniform Commercial Code that you could perfect your security interest in a digital asset through possession of the cryptographic keys or through possession of the majority of the keys. So this is important for Bitcoiners because you don't want to have to be, if you're taking Bitcoin as collateral in some sort of lending arrangement, you don't want to have to send up to the Texas Secretary of State or wherever, whatever state you're in, a financing statement or a UCC1, perfecting your security interest in that collateral to let everybody know that you have a security interest in that collateral, because then everyone knows who you are and that you have a security interest in Bitcoin. And it's sort of a security risk, right? So that was an important bill. It created precedent in the Uniform Commercial Code for intangible assets like Bitcoin. Of course, you already had general intangibles before that, but it sort of created this new arrangement for Bitcoin to be treated in that way. And so that was one of the two bills passed early on. And then this last session, we had several other bills that we were working on. Of course, they don't all pass, but the ones that did, one of them was a Bitcoin mining related bill, House Bill 591, that this was this past year, about a year ago. That one allows for Bitcoin miners to take formerly flared gas and use it in, for Bitcoin mining on site. And the operator can sell that gas to the Bitcoin miner and not have to pay severance tax. And that is because flared gas, you don't pay severance tax on when you're flaring it. So why would we have this perverse incentive that doesn't allow you to then, you can sell the gas to the Bitcoin operator, but then are you liable to pay severance tax on it? And so the bill clarified that you're not. And it's just a signal that Bitcoin miners can use to take to oil and gas operators and say, hey, you've got an economic product that you're not making anything on. You're making money on your oil, but this associated gas, you're having to flare it off because there's no pipeline. Why don't you sell it to me for $1, $2 an MCF and go from there?
Yeah, that's actually it seems like a no-brainer. If I was a critic of Bitcoin mining and I saw that Bitcoin miners were using it from flared gas, I mean, it's hard to say like that's bad, right? I mean, it's literally flared out and wasted, and it's also harmful for the environment to flare gas. And now you can use it economically to mine Bitcoin. So it's good that they don't have to pay a tax anymore. And you said that you kind of focused on Bitcoin mining in general. I wonder if you could break down like a little bit of those conversations, whether it's the energy industry there or the grid operators. Do they kind of gain a better understanding of how Bitcoin mining could help their operations?
Yeah, we've had to really dig in really deep with ERCOT, and at any given time, about 3% of Texas power consumption is going to Bitcoin mining, which is not a small number. And when you have a grid that's got a lot of renewables on it, like we do here in Texas, about 30% renewables between wind and solar, and that's growing. you have to have flexible load. And so we are constantly in conversation about Bitcoin mining with ERCOT and with the legislature, working to ensure that they understand this technology. We are the most flexible load anywhere in the world. There are flexible gen like batteries, and Bitcoin is essentially a capacitor on the demand side for what batteries do on the supply side, right? So they're not a perfect comparison, but they both are capacitors in a sense, and can pull from the grid and push power back to the grid, just in different ways. And that's so with the ERCOT Large Flexible Load Task Force, that's really what we've been working on communicating is miners want to step into that role. Now we do have a little bit of I guess cognitive dissonance or some communication challenges around how flexible miners are. Of course, we know the potential is that miners can be flexible on a second by second basis. In fact, as a CLR, on a millisecond by millisecond basis for frequency stabilization of a grid, which is incredibly helpful. But that requires a lot of software and a lot of expertise, and just not all Bitcoin miners are there yet. But imagine a day when all 2,400 megawatts of Bitcoin mining in ERCOT can be that capable, right? It's already capable within minutes, but imagine if it's all capable within seconds. So that's a very important concept that we're working to communicate. And there's a lot to be worked out there. It's not something that can be solved overnight.
Yeah. Would you say that ERCOT, though, is kind of receptive of how Bitcoin mining could help the grid, or is there pushback? I remember Brad Jones, who's the former ERCOT president CEO. He passed away, so rest in peace. But he had a couple clips that spoke very positively of Bitcoin, and it means a lot coming from somebody like that with that credibility. Is that the conversations that you're getting from ERCOT, that they are receptive to Bitcoin mining, or is there still kind of some pushback around that?
Certainly both. Brad was a very great ally for us. And when he retired from his role as the CEO of ERCOT, he came on as a consultant for the TBC
Mm.
and was just incredible to have. And we were really saddened by his passing from cancer, just taken way too early. But unfortunately, it's not universal within ERCOT. There's still some skepticism and some concern around the speed at which Bitcoin mining has come up, right? Gone from
Yeah.
5 megawatts to 2,400 megawatts in a span of 4 years is pretty crazy. And so that is of concern. There's also about 30,000 megawatts of Bitcoin mining in the interconnection queue, but we all know that the vast majority of that is what we're calling phantom load. That's never going to come online. That's people throwing mud against the wall to see what sticks, right? Maybe they want to build a 10 megawatt site, but they apply for load in 7 different places. Well, that comes up looking like 70 megawatts. But in reality, it's only 10, and we don't even know if that 10 is going to get built. So just like on the generation interconnection side with solar, you can think about that in a way that 1/10 of it will actually come to fruition, right? So we're probably going to cap out under 5,000 megawatts of Bitcoin mining in Texas, just by the sheer economics of it, right? Having coming up, low-hanging fruit has already been taken, but that's still a lot of development that needs to happen.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned that after the China ban, you just saw this huge migration of hash rate to the United States, and a lot of that seemed to end up in Texas because it's kind of unique, right? It has its own grid with ERCOT, cheap energy because of all that renewable build out that's occurred there, and um, recently there was that January winter storm, and you saw a lot of seemingly what it was, like curtailment in response to that storm. I guess this is a two-part question. One, does it concern you when like all the hash rate kind of drops at the same time, just in terms of the security of the network, if they're kind of responding to these, maybe they have power purchase agreements in place where they kind of turn off. And then second, like, what do you think made up that drop in hash rate? Was it really miners kind of responding to the storm and to help stabilize the grid? Was it something else? Love to hear your thoughts around that.
Yeah, I was looking at this, and there was a lot of articles about how the Texas hash rate dropping off made the global hash rate drop. And I think it was hash rate dropping off all over North America, certainly a lot in Texas as well. But we never got above $500 per megawatt hour in ERCOT during this last January. And the break-even price for Bitcoin miners is anywhere from $100 to $250 a megawatt hour, depending on a lot of factors. Some people just don't like to turn on and off their machines to damage them. Some people have hosting agreements that they have a certain percentage of uptime. So that range is pretty wide. So we definitely saw economic curtailment, but I think what we saw from a broader sense was that there was that going on all over the country. And the TBC represents miners that are global, that have operations here in Texas, but all over the country and all over the world. And I think it's important to note that the way that these power markets are priced, they're unpredictable in such that I'm not really concerned about a concentration of hash rate in the US or even in Texas, because it's impossible for an actor, a malicious actor, to predict pricing. I mean, if you could, then you could make billions of dollars trading, power futures, right?
Yeah.
So it's really impossible for people to predict. And I think once you see the hash rate drop, it happens so fast that it could already be back online. I mean, these things are they're so dynamic that I just don't think that there's any real security risk to have an unexpected drop in hash rate to respond to some high prices. Now there would be if it was telegraphed, a few days in advance or something like that. But just the dynamic nature of it, I think it's impossible for somebody to predict that.
I wonder if we could maybe dig into the idea of curtailment a little bit more. I recently had Bob Burnett on the show, and I don't know if you know Bob, but he had some interesting thoughts around curtailment, because he's like, well, miners have to think about what they're actually doing. Are they supporting Bitcoin, even though it might be more profitable for them to do so, to curtail? Are they actually supporting Bitcoin when they do that? Because the hash rate goes down, as well as they're not getting Bitcoin themselves anymore. They're actually getting fiat. And there's this narrative in Washington with some politicians where they say actually Bitcoin's putting pressure on the grid, and there's a lot of education of why it could potentially help stabilize it. So it's a powerful argument, I think, for why Bitcoin mining could be important. But as Bob mentioned, does it actually help the network that the miners are curtailing? Do you have any thoughts around that argument?
Yeah, I think we want economically and commercially healthy Bitcoin miners, right? So if they're making poor economic decisions, that's probably not a great long-term path. And two, I think, as we see attack vectors on Bitcoin, we are going to have to be cognizant of the energy use attack vector. And for miners to not take that position of leadership is a very difficult political discussion, right? And it showcases Bitcoin's resilience. And I think the more resilient everyone sees that it is, the stronger the network grows to be.
It makes a lot of sense. Yeah, you mentioned how the energy argument. It's been a top of mind in DC as well as the Bitcoin community for a long time. That kind of debate around Bitcoins. Is it good for the environment? Is it bad? And obviously, Bitcoiners take the position that there's a lot of benefits actually that Bitcoin mining could bring. But we recently had the EIA come out and issue a mandatory survey. They actually called it an emergency mandatory survey for Bitcoin miners. And it kind of caught the eye of the industry for obvious reasons. But one of the reasons was the scope of what they were asking these miners to report. Even the geographic coordinates of their operations, what machines they use, what they're mining. It was very extensive in terms of what they were asking. And I was wondering first, is it, in your experience of what you talked to, is it normal for the EIA to ask an industry to do something like this, and to the scope that they are asking for in terms of what they're asking for these miners to report?
No, absolutely not. In fact, I had a conversation with some folks at the EIA over the phone, and they admitted that it is not normal, and this is something new for them. It's clear that there's political pressure here. They're even threatening to fine miners $10,000 per day for non-response.
Wow.
And there's also criminal liability as well, which is unprecedented for a survey like this. But we can all see why, right? Elizabeth Warren was on the Armed Service Committee, of course, still is, and she was interviewing the Secretary of Energy, and the conversation turned to Bitcoin mining, and she said, "TikTok, when are you going to start this survey? Like, time is running out. I want you to have this survey and have this data before you come testify in front of this committee again." And so that's publicly available. We have that video
Wow.
clip. We know that EIA sits under the Department of Energy, and it's clear that that pressure was pushed down and caused them to submit this bogus emergency data collection. By emergency, they were able to bypass the mandatory notice and comment period, in which we could have, as an industry, said, "Hey, we're happy to be transparent and share information about energy use, but we are going to respectfully request that you remove questions that would cause competitive harm." The EIA is not allowed to cause competitive harm
Okay.
based on their mandate. And things like your energy provider, the kinds of machines that you're using, those things all would cause competitive harm. Not to mention, my concern is that Elizabeth Warren gets a hold of that, and then she's browbeating and harassing different energy companies because they're working with Bitcoin miners. That is not an outcome that we would want, and it's certainly not an outcome that is lawful under the mandate for the EIA, and or even constitutional for a congresswoman to do.
Well, it's interesting to hear that even the EIA officials or sources that you've spoken to say that this is not normal. So it's not just the Bitcoin community getting all riled up here. This is abnormal. They're coming out and they're asking for extensive details. And I didn't really know that the fact that they called it an emergency, that they could bypass any kind of comment period. I thought that was more just like a choice of words. But that's really interesting.
Yeah, the comment period is right now. So like they're collecting data, the data is due on Friday, and they're collecting data during the comment period, which is unheard of, right? You have a notice and comment for a reason. The government's thinking about doing this. Here's this time. You can have a conversation with them, make suggestions, recommendations, and then at some later date they implement it. That's not what they're doing here. They're implementing it. They're requiring February data collection, and they're collecting comments during the survey, which is
I got
backwards. It's backwards and asinine. It doesn't make any sense.
Wow. It's just never like these. It seems like Bitcoin is just top of mind for a lot of these politicians. I mean, obviously Elizabeth Warren has taken like a personal vendetta against it for whatever reason. There's other politicians that are supportive. You kind of just showed me a survey that you guys done, kind of breaking down the demographics. And can you just share some of the results that you've shown in terms of Bitcoin? I think you looked at, Democrats versus Republican versus independent, what their views are, gender, race. Can you maybe break down some of those key findings to let us know where people stand more broadly, or what the survey results showed?
Yeah, certainly. This is a survey that we commissioned through a third-party polling agency that does these kind of things. And so it's a large survey, a demographic with a 2.2% margin of error. It is a little bit old. It wasn't commissioned this year, but the data is nonetheless relevant, and in fact, probably growing, right, as adoption grows. But we found that 29% of likely voters in Texas own Bitcoin or some other kind of digital asset. That is much higher than the average American. And so we're proud to see that Texans are adopting this faster than their peers in other parts of the country. But we also saw that Bitcoin ownership was split pretty evenly across political parties. It skewed very young. You were 49%, a lot more like, or excuse me, 49% of people under the age of 29 own Bitcoin or digital asset, but only 6% of people over the age of 65. So you really see that huge skew in the graph where age is a big factor. Political affiliation is really not a factor. And so we saw a pretty equal distribution amongst Democrats, independents, and Republicans. But age was a big factor for sure.
It's kind of exciting to hear, actually. On the surface, it seems like it seems like the Republicans are a little bit more receptive of Bitcoin than the Democrats. Maybe it's just kind of top heavy there because of Elizabeth Warren and others that have taken like a really loud, strong stance against it. But I think it makes sense to me because if you think about Democrats and Republicans, Bitcoin has certain traits that kind of could attract both of them for different reasons, I would say. And so when you're talking to a politician, do you change the way you educate them based off their political affiliation at all, or do you keep the message kind of the same?
Yeah, I think you have to tailor the message for sure. And so we do tailor the message. And one of the I think we touched on this earlier, but central bank digital currencies is going to be the number one issue that Bitcoin is brought up in tandem with, right? So
Mm.
it's CBDCs, it's stablecoins, and it's Bitcoin. And that is going to be where the political conversation goes. And the more that we can show that CBDCs are totalitarian and a tool of government surveillance, and that Bitcoin is the opposite. And I think this is going to be a hot take, and perhaps many of the audience will disagree with me on this, but I think we also have to communicate to elected officials that Bitcoin is not going to dethrone the dollar as the world reserve currency anytime soon, right? We're going to do that on our own through profligate government spending. Like the dollar is going to rise or fall as the world reserve currency based upon the U.S. monetary policy and how much quantitative easing or injections there are by the Fed in the coming years. So I think the narrative that Bitcoin should be the world reserve currency is not helpful in the short term. Like, will it be it one day? Very possible, right? Will it be it was part of a basket of reserve currencies in the future? Very possible. I think even likely. But should we be talking to elected officials about that right now? Probably not. We need to be talking about how Bitcoin prolongs the dollar as the world reserve currency, because so much of that activity is here in the US, both mining and financial activity. And if other central banks and other large institutions see that the US financial position is stronger, they will buy more dollars and therefore prolong the dollar as the world reserve currency. And that's the dollar is dirty fiat, right? So like that is sort of a hot take, I think, for Bitcoiners. But in the political conversation, it's a non-starter to start with, hey, the US dollar is fiat and it's backed by nothing and it's garbage.
Yeah, that's going to turn them off pretty fast.
Turn them off. We all know that it's like
Yeah.
essentially true. It's propped up by psychology and by the taxing power of the U.S. government, and it's unfortunate, but we have to couch it in those terms of like, hey, we don't want the dollar to fall anytime soon. If it does fall, hopefully it's over a long period of time, and Bitcoin gradually rises to be part of that basket of reserve currencies over time. If it happens quickly, then that pretends some sort of economic collapse. And I think I'm a little bit more pragmatic than most on that. Some people will disagree with me, but that's okay.
I think it's a fair point. I mean, you can't go in there like you attract more people with honey than vinegar, I guess you could say, when you go in there. If you go in there and say that the dollar is going to get wrecked, even if you believe it and that Bitcoin's going to take over, I think people are not going to be willing to listen to you as much. So I think you got to be, tactful with how you bring it up. I always thought that Bitcoin kind of aligns with American values, and I always hope that America would embrace Bitcoin to benefit from it. Just because I am an American citizen, I think it could really be helpful. Are you optimistic with how things are going right now? Especially, I just read Galaxy's mining report said a significant amount of the hash rate that has come online has happened internationally. They don't know if it's nation states or private companies or whatever, but I personally believe that some nation states are getting involved abroad. Are you optimistic with how adoption's happening at the political level in terms of Bitcoin, how it's being perceived? Um, Up to this point, I guess I could say, like, because I look around the world and some of them seem like they're kind of pushing forward faster. You got Europe doing the MiCA legislation. At least it's some kind of framework, but it seems like things are kind of happening very slowly here. What are your takes there?
I think the Bitcoin ETF, the spot ETF approvals were significant because it furthers Bitcoin's number one use case in the U.S., which is as an asset, as a store of value. And of course, we tend to have really strong payment networks here relative to the rest of the world that could be made better by Lightning and other layer two solutions on Bitcoin. But that's not going to be the use case that wins out here, just because relative to the rest of the world, our payment systems are quite robust and modern. Now, if you're in Nigeria or Vietnam or some of these other nation states that are leading adoption as a percentage of transactions or per capita on a per capita basis, um, the payments is going to be the number one use case there, and that's very exciting. So I think that's not saying anything new. Everybody kind of knows that already. So I guess what I am saying is we shouldn't undercount the importance of the ETF because they enable uh, the US centric adoption use case, which is
Yeah.
long-term savings vehicle and a store of value.
Yeah, it's hard to make the argument that Bitcoin's only used for criminal activity if these ETFs exist and all these people have exposure to Bitcoin in their retirement accounts and millions of Americans are holding it. I mean, they already hold Bitcoin to that number, but it's going to increase substantially. I think these Bitcoin represent a huge on ramp that could potentially happen. Um, let's touch on that subject of Bitcoin is used for illicit activity. I'm sure it's something that you hear a lot in your conversations. You just saw Gary Gensler on CNBC kind of saying this stuff about, hey, Bitcoin's only used, it's primarily used for criminal activity. And even in the letter in response to the spot Bitcoin ETF approvals, in his letter, he said it's primarily used for criminal activity. And I thought those choice of words were just straight up false, a misrepresentation. People always point to the chain analysis reports, but I read an article that you read, and you actually pointed to a article or report by a former CIA acting director, Michael Morrell. And I think that's important because people could point to the chain analysis and say, hey, they're a little bit biased. They're in the industry. Can we trust that data? But I think it's significant that a former CIA acting director, he said basically it's significantly overstated the illicit activity that happens on Bitcoin. How do you approach that debate, I guess you could say, in a way that you get the ears of these politicians who believe that Bitcoin's just used for criminals? Like, how do you address that FUD?
It is a big challenge, and I think the first news story that the Wall Street Journal did specifically around the Hamas financing was
Yeah.
quite unfortunate. Of course, they used data that was incorrect and ended up having to correct that at a later point. And thankfully, during a committee hearing, there was a admission by the U.S. Treasury that data was incorrect. The damage was done, though, right?
Yeah.
The perception damage was done. And so the only thing we can do is continue to come back with more and more data. And companies like Chainalysis and others that are really producing these technical reports about illicit use, I think we should say, hey, we do see X number of transactions or X percentage of transactions. There's a guy named Gervis Greg who's the CTO for the public sector for Chainalysis. I interviewed him recently. They just came out with their 2023 numbers and updated a few of their 2022 numbers, and the illicit activity remains far below what we see in the banking system and what we see with hard currencies. Not only of course, in volume and aggregate, but also on a per transaction or per capita basis. So the data is our friend. We really are fighting an uphill battle there, though, and so I think PR strategy and communications are going to be important, because we're having to fight a media apparatus that doesn't want the data to be presented accurately. And Gary Gensler's a perfect example of that. Like, the way that he's seen those reports, he knows that
Yeah.
there are illicit transactions that use Bitcoin, but the percentage is relatively small, especially when you compare it to other methods of payment. And he's simply being he's kind of manipulating the American people, I think at the behest of staffers within the Biden administration, which the Biden administration was mostly staffed by Senator Warren.
Yeah, it's frustrating. That Wall Street Journal article, you're right. I mean, from a perception standpoint, it did so much damage. It took basically the whole community to raise awareness around why it was false, for them to eventually, make an addendum in there and say, like, oh, we're false. And then, a lot of people read that article, but not a lot of people paid attention last Wednesday when the Treasury Undersecretary Brian Nelson admitted that it was basically false. And it's like, in response to that article, you had Elizabeth Warren and over 100 lawmakers write a letter to the Biden administration addressing crypto-related financing, basically saying, citing that article as evidence. The wheels got rolling there. And so it's super frustrating, because there's some sources right now that are saying the Senator Sherrod Brown is going to bring Elizabeth Warren's bill for markup in committee at the Senate Banking Committee now, before it can maybe be voted for the Senate floor. And it's all based on these false data. So do you think it's just from a community standpoint? It's like, we have to kind of produce more data, just get that education out there, call them out when they're doing this, and come together as a community? Like, how can we fight this narrative? Because it's so frustrating, to be honest with you. I mean, how many years have we heard this narrative? And you could point to this, well, the dollar, you can point to some of this reports, but it just seems like one article comes out that's basically fake news, and it just gets the ball rolling at the political level. Like, how do we fight this from, it's frustrating, not gonna lie.
Yeah, it is. And I see some people commenting in the chat that, we really don't need to be doing any data aggregation. We just need to be buying and holding Bitcoin in cold storage, right?
That's fair.
And that's accurate, right? Like, I think there's a big part of the community that, by them doing that, they're supporting the network, and it's unnecessary for them to kind of waste their time and economic resources on kind of the data collection argument and the discussion. Now, people like you and I that get in front of elected officials a lot, we sort of have that burden. And I think the more that we can share amongst, trade associations and different entities, different companies, the better. But there's different, I think different tasks fall to different people. And so I certainly think that for the vast majority of the community that want to just hodl, and they want to hold their own keys, that's all they really need to do. And the rest of us can work to change some hearts and minds. But in the end, the train has left the station, right? Like, eventually, there was a lot of criticism about the motor vehicle, in the early 1900s. A lot of criticism about the internet in the early 2000s, and we may have seen greater amounts of scrutiny than either of those two industries, but it's unstoppable. And I think for the vast majority of Bitcoiners to have to worry about that, I'm not sure if it's really one of the top things that they should have to worry about.
Amen to that. It's very true. I mean, just buy and hold Bitcoin. That's probably the best thing a pleb can do, or any Bitcoiner. Yeah, I agree completely. So when you look out at your work at the Texas Blockchain Council, what are you guys focused on over the next year or two? Maybe what gets you excited? What are some problems you're trying to address? Give me like the outlook for the next 12 to 24 months.
Yeah, so Texas has a legislative session in January of next year that we're preparing for. We're of course going to want to ensure that the Bitcoin mining industry is treated fairly. There was a bill last session to remove Bitcoin miners from ERCOT's demand response docket. So we were able to kill that bill, but it may came up again. And so now with Swan being a big player in Bitcoin mining, I'm sure that's of interest to you guys. So we'll ensure to our efforts will be essentially focused on making sure that Bitcoin mining is treated just like other industrial consumers of electricity, and is not harassed because of the end use of that electricity, right? So if a data center is able to participate in demand response that does AI LLMs, then Bitcoin miners need to be able to participate in the same way. And so that is kind of the status quo. So we're working to maintain the status quo on that front, but we're also working to pass legislation in other areas as well. So DAOs is one area. We wrote some pretty comprehensive DAO legislation here in Texas. It passed the Texas House. It did not pass the Texas Senate. So we've got to work on that and submit that and refile that in the Texas legislature to see if we can further ensure that decentralization is a pillar and a cornerstone of the state of Texas, and that entrepreneurs and investors and builders can come here and build as they see fit.
Awesome. Well, good luck with your work, and thanks for fighting the good fight. It's important to advocate and teach these people who want to learn, especially these policymakers. As you know, I agree that the train has left the station, but they can do harm in delaying its adoption, I think. So, like, obviously we'd want this to be supportive of Bitcoin, and we want, a Bitcoin standard, if you will, or hyper Bitcoinization, I think, to happen as quickly as possible so that people can protect their purchasing power from inflation and all that stuff. So I appreciate the work that you're doing. And if anybody's interested in the North American Blockchain Summit, I mean, you guys doing it again in 2024, I assume, right?
That's right. Yeah. November 20th and 21st, 2024 in Dallas, Texas, at the Bush Center, which is, of course, George Bush's presidential library. It's going to be a very, very cool venue, very elegant, and kind of looks like you're walking in the State Department when you get to that venue. So cool.
And where can people find your work or learn more about the Texas Blockchain Council if they're interested?
Yeah, just texasblockchaincouncil.org. We have a specific page dedicated to Bitcoin mining. A lot of resources there for folks who maybe are communicating with journalists, or maybe just an office friend who doesn't understand how Bitcoin mining interacts with the grid, or incentivizes more renewables. So people can go there, and they can also go to the NorthAmericanBlockchainSummit.com to learn about the summit. And hopefully they'll come and be impressed in a similar way that you were, Sam.
Yeah, I had a great time. So people should check it out. And thanks so much for sharing your insights, Lee, coming on the show. Really appreciate it, taking the time, and best of luck with everything you're working on. Okay.
Yep. Appreciate it. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah. Have a good day. Well, that was fun. I really appreciate talking to Lee. Like I said, he's kind of behind the scenes, like talking to people that really are in powerful positions. And like I said, we don't want to delay Bitcoin adoption. And ideally, I would like America to embrace Bitcoin and kind of fight back against some of the FUD or some harmful regulation that can come down, or legislation. So appreciate everything Lee's doing. So give him a follow. Go check out the Texas Blockchain Council and all the great work they're doing. Thank you for listening to another episode of Swan Signal Live. Please give us a follow or subscribe to the YouTube channel. That always helps us increase our reach to get the Bitcoin message out. Like, comment, let me know what you thought of the episode. We got another great episode lined up next week. We get James Safer from Bloomberg Intelligence. He's the ETF guy. So for all the ETF questions, I'm going to be peppering him. He's a great dude. So excited to talk to him. We'll be releasing that next week. And thanks again for listening. I'm out.